everybody, and welcome to Spooky Middle Grade Book Club. Tonight we are talking about The Witches of Willow Cove, I never do this right, there we go, by Josh Roberts, and we are joined by the author himself, Hooray. I am Jacqueline West, author of The Books of Elsewhere, The Collectors. My latest is a middle grade mystery called Long Lost, which just came out in May. And also here with us are Tanya Del Rio, Janet Fox, and Kim Ventrella. Tanya, can you tell us briefly about your latest book?
Yes, I am the author of the War in the 13th series, and it's a trilogy, and the last book recently came out, well, actually not that recently, during the pandemic. It's called War in the 13th and the 13-Year Curse, and it's about a 13-year-old bellhop who manages his family's creepy hotel.
That's still recent because pandemic time is meaningless. It feels like it could be.
Yeah, it feels like yesterday, but it also feels like 100 years ago. So
I totally hear that. And Janet Fox also just had a book release.
I did. This is my newest. It's called Carry Me Home. It's very shiny. I love how shiny it is. And it's not a spooky book. It's a book about a homeless girl, but it's also a book about community and connection, and it has a very hopeful message in it. But my two spooky books are The Charmed Children of Rookskill Castle. Oh, it's very backwards. So it's hard to see where it's going. Charmed Children of Rookskill Castle, and the companion book, The Artifact Hunters, which came out last summer in the middle of the pandemic. So we're all pandemic babies here.
Yes, we are. Including Kim, right? Your most recent was also during all of this?
I am. I had 3 pandemic babies, well, 2. So I had Hello Future Me that came out in August of 2020, The Secret Life of Sam the month after. And of course, for all of the Scary Stories fans, I was part of this anthology, Don't Turn Out the Lights. And this is like the official tribute to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So there's lots of really cool horror stories in that one.
Fabulous. So it's lovely to see you all. We always get to see each other like this these days on a screen, but in my head, we are all like gathered around a little table in the back of an eerie but cozy coffee shop, which is decorated for Halloween all year round, and Kim is having her traditional goat's blood latte. Someday we'll have to do that in person. But now back to Josh and his fabulous middle grade debut, The Witches of Willow Cove. For those of you who haven't read it yet, it is the story of a group of 7th graders living in the small town of Willow Cove, Massachusetts, who discover one by one that they are witches. And as they learn to use their powers, guided by this mysterious new teacher in town, Miss Winters, they learn more and more about the history of Willow Cove, including some terrible things that have happened there in the past, and about how that past is going to collide with their present. So sorry if I did a terrible job with that, Josh.
No, here I'm just taking notes about how I might describe the book in the future. I'm just going to have you come with me at all times.
I can do that. Well, I was actually going to ask you, what do you usually say when people ask you, so what's the book about? Do you have a great pitch? What do you focus on?
I usually end up talking mostly about Abby and her storyline, and I think a lot of people end up not getting the impression that it's a dual storyline, a dual perspective with a second viewpoint character who's critically important, but not a magical witch like Abby. But I usually end up talking about Abby and the group, and Miss Winters may or may not have something sort of nefarious planned for them. And I always kind of bring it back to her best friend, Robbie, who, sort of begins to suspect that there might be something more going on, and that it might be related to his own mother's disappearance.
And I love all of that. I want to talk a lot more about the friendship relationships here and the magical versus reality stuff that you play with. But one of the first things that stood out to me right from the beginning is this is such great upper middle grade. I mean, all the kids are literally on the threshold of teenagehood. Like the magical things start to happen to them on their 13th birthdays. And I love that the story even begins on Halloween night with Abby, one of your 2 protagonists, literally changing costumes from like her frou-frou princess dress into a witch costume. And it's just like this great little symbolic moment between childhood and like the future self that she's going to be. So I'd love to know more about, why did writing for this particular age group, which is tricky to do, middle grade often skews a bit younger, why did writing for this age matter to you?
I think there's a few reasons. One is that, I feel like there aren't that many books, or at least at the time when I sat down to write this book to begin with, there weren't that many books for kids that wanted to read about, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. There was a gap in the market between middle grade, which tended to skew younger, at oldest sort of 8 to 12, and then young adult, which always tends to go sort of 16, 17, 18, and deals with issues, even when it's younger, young adult tends to deal with issues that are maybe not as interesting to kids in that in-between stage. And it's such an important time in a reader's development, let alone, in your life development. But, to find those stories to kind of bridge the gap, just looking at in my own kids' reading experience, looking for those books that are a little more sophisticated, a little more, the sort of longer, more complex, but, maybe not delving into some of the stuff that we think of as traditionally with young adult. So that was a big part of it. But another part for me was just sort of from personal experience. That age is, when I really sort of think that I kind of became the person that I was going to become, there's sort of, you're kind of figuring out. But for me, when you hit 13, 14, 15, I still have very strong, vivid memories from that age. Things that happened then, continue to kind of reverberate through my life now. And I feel like it's such a critical moment, as, transition from adolescence to teenagedom, that I just felt like it was a really ripe area to explore, from a literary sense as well. And these characters going through this really critical period of their lives.
That's really scary to think of my 13-year-old self as being like somehow formative of myself now. Oh boy, I don't want to look back at my middle school self for sure.
Oh, same. But yes, at the same time, I know she is woven into everything that I write, especially when I am writing for the age group. So yes, still very much in touch with that younger self, even though I want to hope I've grown up a little bit. So by the way, fellow spookies and people who are watching, feel free to chime in at any point with questions, comments, anybody who wants to jump in. Otherwise, I will just keep trucking along, because I also wanted to ask you about, like you just mentioned, really the real world problems and drama of that age. So you've got, school bullies and cliques and dating for the first time and family disruption and wanting more independence. All of this real world 13-year-old stuff ends up looming as large often as these really dangerous supernatural problems. And it was amazing to me how well you balanced that. How did you pull that off? And was that intentional, trying to, keep the two on track?
It was definitely intentional. To me, I think it's a critical part of the story. And in some ways, those relationships and those dynamics are even more interesting to me than the witchcraft and the fantasy elements, which I think are maybe unintentionally vehicles to explore those sorts of things. I think that some of it comes from as a kid, I read a lot of Marvel comics, and that was a big hallmark of Marvel, was that it was the sort of soap opera elements in addition to the superheroics. And I think as I was writing it, the witches sort of became this superhero group in my mind, with their sort of dynamics between them. But then the interpersonal part of it really interested me, and I ended up writing a lot of chapters and then condensing them down that had a lot more of that sort of drama between them and just the relationships, particularly the friendships and how those sort of developed and everything, because that has just fascinated me, and I found it such a rich area to explore when I was writing.
I think that's what I loved so much about this book. It's so rich. There's just so much going on, and kids would gravitate maybe to the magical aspects of it, but in fact, I think the interpersonal relationships and those budding romances and those friendship dynamics were so well drawn. I think it's really clever. It's cleverly done, and it's a mile-a-minute book. Boy, oh boy.
I agree. It really brought me back to being that age, and I kind of almost forgot, maybe because I blocked it out, how stressful it could be to have these friendships tested by new students or by changing feelings for other kids, and just like how complicated that could be. And it was just like, it really brought me back. You like really captured it so well. And you also managed to like really explore the different personalities of so many different characters, which I think is really challenging when you have a large cast, but you did it so well as far as like having them work with and against each other in really unique ways.
I love too how like you really dive into the magic right away and you don't hold back. Like just right away, it's the gargoyles or the chimera or whatever that are like coming to life, and then they're like flying on the broomstick, like bam, they're like off the cliff and they're flying on it. But so I think that's so cool because you do, you know, like the thing that Stephen King does with those ridiculous concepts, but he grounds them in character, and so you ground them in those like real character moments. But was that like a choice you made up front? Because I feel like as an author sometimes I'm reluctant to just dive right in so boldly to the magic, and I want to spend like all this time just like being like, oh, I'm gonna really slowly drag you along. Like, you know, it's fun. I love how you just like plopped us right into the magic though. I'm
gonna use that as a pull quote for the next book. Ridiculous concept.
That's what all of like Stephen King's books are, right? But he pulls them off because of that character development.
So it's interesting because the first draft, the first chapter didn't end that way, and it actually it ended with them, you know, finding a black cat, and that was sort of the progression of the story. And I was like, well, that wasn't quite fitting, you know, sitting for me the way I wanted it to. And then I do this little trick where as I'm writing, I'm always like, well, what's the most exciting thing that could happen right now? And which 99% of the time means I end up throwing away my outline and doing something else, because in the moment that I'm writing it, I'm like, oh, you know what should happen? They should have to like jump off the cliff, and then they're actually flying. And I'm like, okay, well, there goes chapters, you know, 2 through 9 that I had planned, but okay, let's see what happens now. And I love to do that. You know, I think that mile a minute pace is definitely a choice. It's sort of that, again, kind of almost like a serialized approach to telling this sequential story. I want every chapter to make you be like, oh, what's going to happen next? Which can be a challenge, especially when you're writing a dual point of view, and you love to be in that, you know, one character's story, but you have to kind of balance it out and then shift to another character and make your audience still care and want to keep reading, which is where I think the overarching mystery comes in, and this whole sense that like each chapter is going to contribute something towards piecing together this supernatural puzzle, and then, you know, hopefully the readers have faith that it all comes together towards the end and then it makes sense. But yeah, definitely intentionally putting those exciting moments early on became a trademark, a hallmark of what I wanted to do as I was writing and revising.
I love that, and I think your pull quote is also just like Stephen King. Like, you can say that. But to return to the friendship thing and the dual point of view thing, you've got Abby and Robbie, and one of my favorite lines in the whole book is when Robbie's dad tells him there's no such thing as just friends. And I think, oh, I love that, because so often we do kind of devalue friendship. We act like, you know, romance is somehow more important or bigger or better. And the fact that the two of them just stay friends through the whole thing, that there are, you know, dating interests, but it's not between them. I love that. And I thought that, yes, centering that kind of friendship and letting that drive the plot was really beautifully done. And then speaking of friendships, so one of my favorite side characters is a new friend of Abby's is Amethyst. Oh, because I love an angry goth girl, and an angry goth girl with a raccoon is even better. So I want to know, where did she come from? What was the inspiration behind her?
She marched onto the page entirely fully formed, and but was originally intended to be a villain, you know, in an original draft, and I had to kind of even that out a little bit when I was revising, as I realized that actually she was not just an ally, but, you know, had her own backstory as well that would, you know, I think dovetail nicely with the story and thematically fit in with what I wanted to do with the friendship of, you know, these two characters, Abby and Robbie, and I wanted them to have their friendship challenged, but also sort of make room for other friends in their lives. you know, when Amethyst originally, she was always going to be an orphan, but the idea that she was living on her own and that she had a raccoon, all of those things, when it came time to write the chapter where Abby goes to see her for the first time, I didn't have a plan. It's just, but that was one of the rare times when I sat down, I started writing, and the chapter wrote itself. And I was like, okay, I guess she's living by herself in a farmhouse with a raccoon and everything's fine. And from there, like, her personality just cemented itself, because I think in a lot of ways, she's the version of me without a filter. You know, she's able to say, you know, the snarkiest thing and kind of get away with it, because you kind of know that secretly, although she's, you know, sort of prickly on the outside, she's got this kind of soft side, you know, a little bit sweet on the inside. And yeah, she's so much fun to write, and a great sort of counterpoint for Abby, who's more sort of like focused on you know, angsty things. Amethyst doesn't have time for any of that.
I think my favorite character personally, though, is Miss Winter. And she is so complex. I love that in an antagonist. I love having an antagonist who has depth and her own sort of trajectory, her own goals, her own motivations. And those motivations are believable and even sympathetic. I love that. Could you talk a bit about her and how you developed her and what you think of her?
I think she's a great character. You know, like, I think that she makes a lot of really good points. And I think that the life that she lived is really, you know, it's tragic in many ways. But it is shaped by the things that happened to her. And what I love about her is this sort of complexity that even though she's got this, you know, nefarious plan, I'm still, you know, even as the author, I'm not 100% sure that she wanted to succeed, because I think that she did come to care for Abby and her friends. And, you know, as I was working on her backstory and sort of figuring out how she got to this moment, you know, I realized that she really did have a friendship with Robbie's mother as well. And she became much more complex for me as I pieced together how she got to this moment. And so I think, you know, in many ways, I may not be done with her story. There may be more to tell about her, you know, what she was up to in the past, and maybe things that could still happen in the future.
Can I just say, I love the part where she like gives Abby her cloak and she's got like a punk shirt underneath, and she's like, "What, you surprised that I like punk?" And then Abby says something to the effect of like, "Well, I didn't know you're a witch." And she's like, "Well, we can be more than just a witch." I mean, that just kind of spoke to her complexity. Like, she is a witch, obviously, but she is a human as well, and she's got interests outside of being a witch. And it's just kind of a nice little moment, I thought.
Yeah, and that line, you know, we're all more than one thing, really helped me understand how I was going to approach the end of the book, because I always knew where I was going, but I felt like, I wasn't sure that I could pull off the ending entirely. But then, you know, as she said that in the story, you know, we're all more than one thing. This like light bulb went on. I was like, oh, okay, I think that's the entryway into the point at the end of the story where Abby is confronting her and talking about these things that she's done. And I think it's really important because we've all made mistakes. We've all done things that we regret. You know, maybe not to the extent that she has, but we don't have to be defined by those. And I thought it was important for Miss Winters to hear that, you know, said back to her, so that even as she's, you know, even as her story is resolving in this book, I think, you know, it was important for her to understand that she imparted this message onto Abby, and then that it was learned and delivered back to her in a way that I think surprised even her and made her see herself in a new way. And I just think that's important in general, because we have, you know, this really knee-jerk reaction to, you know, especially, you know, on social media and sort of mob mentality when someone has done something. And you know, it is like, people are complex and people can have views that don't make sense to us. But, you know, in some cases, that doesn't mean that they're bad people, you know, and I think that it means that people are complicated and that their worldview is shaped by their own experiences. And I think it's important I didn't want to lecture, as I'm saying this, but, if that's something that someone takes out of the book when they're reading it, I think that's an important thing to absorb.
I love how when you're talking about the characters and like discovering parts of their backstory as you're writing it, it makes me wonder how you went about like planning such a complicated story with so many characters. Because I know for me, like a lot of my middle grade novels, they have like 4 characters total, or so, it's like a very small cast. And so I'm just curious, like, how much did you have planned out ahead of time, and how much did you discover along the way?
I think, well, so my process, such as it is, tends to be I get an idea, and I will have a pretty good sense from the start of what the first 3, 4, 5 chapters might look like, and I will write that out. And then I always reach this point where everything comes to a screeching halt, and I'm like, well, now what am I going to do? And that's when I stop and I outline, like, okay, I think this is going to happen, and then I think this is going to happen, and I create this roadmap. But there's a lot of inflection points where I make a note to myself, like, it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be this, and that a lot of times it has to do with the mystery or a character's motivations. And then as I get to that point, I have to make the decision. All right, well, I gave myself 3 options for what the answer here could be. Which one am I going to choose? What am I feeling? And so I would say I'm halfway between a planner and a plotter, or a plotter and a pantser. That because I do like to leave room to just rip up everything that I thought if I thought of something better, which happened a few times. It happened. I will say initially the coven was going to be 13 kids, because I was like, oh, there's some, parallelism with them turning 13. And that quickly I was like, well, the book's going to be 800 pages if I do that. So maybe not 13, maybe 6. And the number 6 ended up coming about because I just had these characters in my mind. And I was like, well, let's just focus on this core group. Who not only do I have ideas, in terms of how they work in this plot, but like each of them started to suggest to me like things that they could get up to in future books. Future, they have these character traits that I'm like, all right, well, what would happen, when this person, is a year older? Will she still feel this way, or will she, reject this part of herself and do something else? And so, I had a general sense of characters and a general sense of where I was going. And, I think some of this, the original draft was about 150,000 words. The final copy is 75,000. So a lot of that was me figuring out as I went. I had to write a lot of chapters to figure out what I could actually cut and what made sense. So I don't recommend my process to anyone, but I am happy with where it led me.
I love that, though. It sounds like you're going back, like you mentioned Marvel. Like, do you think stuff like that, like those like comic book worlds where they have that huge cast and they're always like continuing to change and grow, and they sometimes each branch into their own stories, do you think that type of thing was a big influence for you in this book?
I think so. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about like that, those formative years. Being 13, reading all the Spider-Man comics and the Avengers and the X-Men, like that just imprinted on me in so many ways. And it continues to sort of seep into the things that I say and do even to this day. And, including the storytelling method and the impact that getting to the end of an issue and being like, oh man, I have to wait another month and they left me at this really exciting part. That definitely seeped into the, if you're maybe a reluctant reader or you don't read that many books, I want you to be really excited and want to keep reading it. And I love the books where you don't want to put it down. It's late and you should be going to sleep because you've got a math test tomorrow, but you just want to know what happens. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to write. And that, that Marvel background, the superheroes, the soap opera, the to be continued stuff was all definitely, both in the background and in the foreground of my thoughts as I was writing this.
I love that, the comic book connection. That's really smart, Kim, because the giant universe idea and each character, feeling like they could potentially have their own really rich life. That's really, actually, I wanted to ask, since we're talking about writing middle grade. If we could all grab a time machine and visit 13-year-old Josh, where would we be likely to find you? What would you be doing or reading or wearing? Because I think you've mentioned Indiana Jones, right?
Yes. So my nickname, which I did not give myself, one of my friends gave me, was Indiana Josh. And you would have probably found me somewhere around this age wearing a leather jacket, actually owning a bullwhip that I brought to school one time before I was told I couldn't do that anymore. I had the fedora. I even at one point convinced my parents to dye my hair black or brown so I could have, the full Indiana Jones look. That also got me sent home from school. I told my parents it was a Halloween party and it was okay for me to go dressed like that.
Wait, how did that get you
a Halloween party and it wasn't okay.
They sent you home from school for dyed hair? What?
Oh yeah. I was a distraction.
No way.
Yeah.
To be fair,
they didn't send me home for bringing
the
the bullwhip. They just confiscated the bullwhip. But then another time they were like, "Oh no, now you've gone too far. Your hair is a different color."
Oh boy. Yeah, they tried to do that to me in high school because I used to be super goth and the hair, and I wore a dog harness on my face and all this weird stuff. And they're like, we're gonna send you home because you're distracting the other students. I'm like, no, and they never could. They couldn't. So.
But yeah, at that age, I think 12, 13, I was reading, a lot of comic books, as we discussed. I played a lot of really story-driven computer games. I was big into the graphic adventures of the 1980s and 90s, King's Quest and that sort of thing. Very story-driven. I read a lot of, paperback fantasy novels and everything. In fact, I would sneak them into English class, and I would, sort of be reading Dragonlance under the desk, when we're talking about something that was more literary. But all of that, I think produced a love of reading in me and a love of storytelling. And I think that definitely shaped my desire to write a story that was, first and foremost entertaining, hopefully, and secondly, just kind of letting the themes that came out of it just develop naturally and go from there.
I think you definitely achieved that. Congratulations. So speaking of influences, so I know you live in New England, and witchcraft obviously has deep roots there. Is there anything specific to the setting that influenced you or inspired you or kind of compelled you to weave it into the story?
Yeah, I grew up in New England. I grew up in a small town with a connection to the Salem witch trials. We have actually, in the town that I grew up in, there's which is maybe 10, 15 miles from Salem, but there's a plaque to, someone that was accused of witchcraft. And so that was always sort of fascinating to me. And I think the setting of the town of Willow Cove, in a lot of ways, a lot of it is taken from the area that I live in, which is in New England, and from experiences that I had as a child. One of my friends, lived in a 1600s historical house, and there was a tunnel under his house that had been blocked off. That we removed some of the bricks and went exploring until we got too freaked out and decided to turn around. But that was kind of where the origin of the idea of sneaking into the police station came from. Was where would that tunnel, maybe where did that lead? And it was the sort of thing where we were learned the history that it actually was used as part of the Underground Railroad to hide people there. And all things like that factored in. But, setting wise, setting it on Halloween, setting it in New England is very intentional. I think that, we take Halloween very seriously here, right near Salem. And something about the season, my mood improves dramatically when the calendar goes from August to September, and all of a sudden it's fall, and there's sort of a Christmas in the air, and it's you can smell pumpkin spice everywhere and everything, and cider donuts, and it's beautiful, but it's also it's getting darker, and the leaves are kind of creepy the way they whistle in the wind, and it's sort of a naturally inherent spookiness. And I think that was just the town itself became a character that I sort of really enjoyed writing about in the story.
I'm so with you. I grew up in New England, and that's the one thing I miss about, I live in Montana now, so it's very different, but fall is such a rejuvenating time. It's a time of really great energy. And of course, it's a time of newness for the kids in the story too, is going back to school. But I wanted to ping off of what Jacqueline was asking too. How much of the history that you developed in the story is actually based on true history? I love that kind of like that growth of idea from something that was really true. Did you actually? Yeah,
I did. So there were a few things that I wanted to do with that, and one is the origin of the story actually came about maybe 10 or 15 years before I actually wrote it. I just sort of learned in passing in a totally unrelated setting that the town of Salem, as we know it today, is not actually where the Salem witch trials happened. They happened in the next door town which is now called Danvers. Used to be Salem Village, but when they redrew the lines, over the centuries, I think there might be a line in the book, or maybe it was cut, but Salem got all the tourists, but this other town has all the history. And I loved the concept that these kids living in this town where maybe they don't even know the dark history of their town. And I started asking questions like, well, what if that were the case? Like, what would they do when they found out, and what would they do if they found out that it was, they had a connection to it? So that led me to kind of explore and learn more about the real history of Salem witch trials, which, of course, the poor victims of that weren't witches. And I didn't want to, I know they've been dead for centuries, but I didn't want to like disrespect the memory and the real history of that by saying, oh no, they were witches or anything like that. So I tried to keep everything that I said about the Salem witch trials and the history very, very accurate, to the best of my ability, and create this other history that seemed plausible, in an upper middle grade fashion, fantastical fashion, but seemed sort of plausible within the story to work around the real history. So I do mention some of the original victims, some of the original stories that are described around that time, but I didn't want to take advantage of that in a way that was, exploitative for, these people that actually suffered from this.
And that's actually something else I wanted to ask about, and I'm so glad we got to talk about Salem as well, because I think that's one of the major images of what a witch is or was imagined to be, is tied into the crucible and this sort of Puritan image of what is a witch. But there are so many others in both historical culture and popular culture, everything from the fairy tale witch who eats children to the witches of Macbeth to today, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and of course things like Harry Potter and The Craft and so on. So I was just wondering what images of what a witch is or might be were especially impactful for you. You're muted, Josh.
You'll never know. I was saying, it's maybe kind of a little silly, but I think it might be closest to the whole Sabrina the Teenage Witch vibe. Just because, Abby and her friends, they are witches, but they're people first, and they're people that have these sort of incredible powers that they're just learning to tap into, which, as you're a teenager becoming an adult, that's true regardless of whether or not you have supernatural powers. You are discovering a new place in the world, and a new way to interact with it. But for me, they're sort of human relationships and the dynamic of getting older and dealing with having these powers in middle school, and what that all means. That was the most interesting thing for me. So I think pulling from the whole Sabrina vibe was, and maybe a little bit of the Harry Potter as well, in terms of like that wasn't everything about them, that was a part of them, I think was definitely a factor. And it also there's this wider world of witchcraft that's kind of hinted at, and the mention of the witches' council, and sort of things that have happened and whether or not you can trust them. And I had in my mind that the Witches of Willow Cove, the story itself was, kind of like a pilot episode for a longer storyline. And so I wanted to hint at some things that were out there that we'll definitely be exploring in subsequent books. And one of them is, what are the different types of, witches? How do the politics of all that work? And what is it? Does a witch from, Massachusetts, is that the same thing as a witch from another part of the world? Is that the same thing as, what is it like when you see these really powerful witches that have been around for centuries that are sort of governing the witch community? And so Abby and her friends are kind of a gateway into this for the reader, but in subsequent stories and in the sequel especially, we get to meet the Council of Witches, and we get to meet kind of the, their crossroads where they all come together outside of Willow Cove and see what that looks like. And it's considerably different than, the teenage witch vibe from the first book.
And when will that be out?
Well, the first draft is done, which is for me. I always, I actually don't often use the term first draft. I usually describe them as sort of an exploratory draft because I'm figuring out what is this story. But I wrote that exploratory draft. I have a sense of where it's going now, and it's a much faster from first draft to second draft for me. So I am hoping, fingers crossed, that it would be that I can get it to my editor and get some feedback and everything. And hopefully by the end of next year is the hope that the sequel will be out.
I love that. I have so many thoughts about sequels and doing a long series. And I love the idea of calling it an exploratory draft too, because that's what I should call every one of my first drafts, because I'm just figuring out what the story should be. You're so right. And then I'm probably going to go write the book after that.
I'm really big on phrasing things and giving myself permission to for it not to be very good, or for it not to know exactly what it's going to be. So I play these tricks with my mind.
Yeah, that's so good. But yeah, so on sequel, because I've never done a series before, and one of my big fears with a series, well, I have a lot of fears with a series, but one of them is that because you're talking about this huge world, obviously, that's going to grow and expand, it has to build off everything that you put in the first one. Are you ever afraid that you're going to have established something in the first book that you really desperately want to change, and now you can't? That's always a big fear of mine, that I'm because I just know myself, and I know that it would be so hard for me to let the first one just be set in stone and then have to go from there. And also you have to go back and reread that first book and be really familiar with it years later, and that would be hard for me too.
Yeah. I would say that I thought oh good, I'm gonna write a series, it's gonna be easy because I already know all the characters. No, writing a sequel is terrible, and I hate it. I mean, I love it. I do. I love it, but I hate it. Probably like writing any book. There have been some things that right before. So we did the final edits of the first book, and it was my editor was like, "Are we good? Are we good?" And I was working on the second book at the time, and I was like, "Actually, there's, I want you to put these names in here, and I want to make sure that you mention that there's no cell reception at this one location," and because I was like, I really need, they're going to be here in the second book in chapter 8, and I really need them not to have cell phone, abilities right here. So I was able to sneak some of that stuff in, but I have a kind of a roadmap for where each book could go. And writing a sequel, writing a series for me, another one of those childhood inspirations was, the original Star Wars in 1977, which you'd think, okay, this book about witches is not like that at all. But spoiler alert from Star Wars, they blow up the Death Star and they have a big win. But there's this wider world out there. So, in the Witches of Willow Cove, it's a self-contained story. They defeat the bad guy. There's a new status quo, but you get the sense that there's more story to tell. And that's what I wanted to do with this book. And so I had initially, I think absorbed the Star Wars trilogy model, first book self-contained, second book cliffhanger, third book resolves it. And then when I sat down to write the second book, I realized I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to write a book that just, ended on a cliffhanger or that wasn't a complete story. I wanted to do the same kind of thing. I wanted to write the second book that was also self-contained, also had a beginning, middle, and end, but also changed the status quo. And my thought was, maybe I don't get to write a third book for a couple of years. I don't want people to be left hanging. So, when I really dug into what the second book was, a lot of things happened that changed the status quo and, and set up future stories for them. But I tried to make it in such a way that it would be a satisfying reading experience in and of itself, rather than, in hindsight, when you look back, boy, that really set up the third book well. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do, here's a complete story that you can enjoy, and will leave you wanting more, but not feeling deprived of something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I love series so much. Like, I definitely want to write a series. So I love how you pull all of this like guidance from other types of media. I think that's so smart, and like all of the things that inspired you too. I love that. So I'm gleaning some things from your process tonight. And one of the, just like, make the most exciting possible thing happen. I love that. like always ending on that really exciting moment, and just like being free and like willing to like do anything, like just the most exciting thing. Like, I feel like sometimes I'm afraid to do the most exciting thing because I think it's not going to be like, I'm not going to be able to pull it off. It's not going to be believable if I do it. But like, you pulled it off and you managed to like get that in there. So I think it'll be a fun thing to try as a writer.
Well, the world wants Kim Ventrala series, so we definitely need them. And I will caveat that sometimes the most exciting thing ends up not working, and I have to backtrack and go for the second most exciting thing.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, they can't jump off a cliff in every chapter, but like once it works really well. So.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I'm also thinking, like, after our conversation now, like, about how many of the things that I love that are like sci-fi or fantasy are actually like soap operas too. Like, you're mentioning, like, I just started watching Star Trek for the first time ever. It's like a total soap opera in space. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think you have to really invest in the characters, and there's this. I think there's this myth that books are either plot driven or character driven, and I think my book would fall. If we were categorizing it, it would fall into the plot. It is very, it is very like plotted, and things are revealed at certain times for certain reasons, and the action unfolds in a certain way to maximize the sort of the suspense around it. But for me, like, the most important thing was the characters, and I always I would just agonize over, well, how would she react to the situation, or what would I feel? There are some characters that are just sort of avatars for like things in my life when I've felt excluded or felt not good enough or gotten into a fight or something like that, where I realized like I was kind of at fault. And so a lot of that seeped into it, because the characters are very important to me, even if it is sort of quote unquote a plot driven story. Well, and now I'm even more excited to read book 2, because I so appreciate it when an author doesn't do what you just said. We're acting like book 2 is just kind of a bridge between 2 other books. And having written 2 sequels myself, one the second book in a 5-book series and one a duology, I'm sending you all the best wishes, because those were the hardest, most horrible, heartbreaking things I have written in my entire life. Well, I mean, isn't there this sort of inherent fear that you're going to ruin the first book by doing something terrible with the second one? Yes. That haunts me. It keeps me up at night. I'm like, if everyone hates the second book, does that mean they're not going to like the first book anymore? Well, and everyone who did love the first book, you don't want to disappoint them, and now you've constructed this world that you want to honor. And I decided that I want the sequel to make you kind of feel like you felt when you read the first one, but also be totally different. Have its own themes and have its own. I didn't want it to just be like, and then this happened. I wanted it to be its own thing, but with this familiar cast of characters that hopefully you come to care about and fear for, because some terrible things are going to happen to some great characters. In fact, my my publisher, I was telling her, or the editor, I was telling about like, oh, here's what I'm thinking, and she's like, you should be nicer to those kids. That's kind of mean. So.
Well, this time always goes by so quickly, you guys, and now I think we are at the end of our time. So if any of my fellow spookies have one last thing they want to ask or mention, now would be the chance.
Oh, well, if nobody else has any final questions, Josh, first of all, why don't you tell us where we can find you online and where we can find the Witches of Willow Cove?
All right. On Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, I'm at Josh Who Writes. My website is willowcove.com. And you can find the Witches of Willow Cove at, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere that sells books online, any independent store. Strongly encourage you to order it from your local indie. And I think hopefully soon to be an audiobook as well.
Yay, we love those audiobooks, of course. Well, and I just want to remind everyone that we have a very cool interview coming up with Janet Fox, who is here right now, and we're going to be talking all things and especially her new novel, Carry Me Home. So we're very excited for that one. And if that's all, just give a big thank you. Thanks to Jacqueline for hosting, and thanks to Josh for joining us and talking all about your book and answering our burning questions. I'm going to forever picture you in a fedora now. That is for sure.
I'm okay with that.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to play us out then on a little reminder about our upcoming interview.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.